You asked and we're answering. Whether you attended one of the PADS Professionals Analog Mixed Signal webinars, events live, or watched the recording on demand, some great questions were asked. So let's get the answers. Hi there, I'm John McMillan, and welcome back to another edition of this special series of PCB Tech Talks, the After the Webinar podcast series. In this special podcast series, I'll be joined by webinar presenters, and we'll be answering and discussing the questions submitted by attendees. As always, be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Let us know the topics you'd like to discuss, and if you'd like to be our guest right here on PCB Tech Talk. Today, I'm joined once again by the webinar demo presenter, Rebecca Lord. Hey, Rebecca, welcome back to the After the Webinar series of PCB Tech Talk. We're going to be talking about analog mixed signal.
Thanks, John.
So it was another great event. It was well attended, both sessions actually, European and North America. There were some good questions asked, not as many as I was expecting, particularly in North America, but there were some good questions, and certainly there were a lot of people online. So let's just jump right in and go through the questions that were asked and addressed during the webinar.
Yeah, sure. I'll start out with this one. How is AMS different from other simulation tools like LT-SPICE? So that's a good question. There's two differentiating factors. The first is that you can use both SPICE and VHDL AMS models with PADS Pro AMS, and that gives you a lot more control in customizing your models. The second is that AMS is fully integrated into PADS Designer, which completely eliminates the need to create separate schematic, like a separate schematic for simulation purposes. You can add models directly to your parts that are already in your existing schematic projects, as you probably saw in my webinar.
Yeah. And I don't want to repeat what you said, but it did come up that, I think it's really necessary to really reemphasize that a single schematic drives both simulation and layout in PADS Professional. Because as you saw, like you mentioned Rebecca, and as you saw during her webinar, it's really tightly integrated with PADS Designer, and that means, just like she said, that you can create a schematic you create for simulation is the same schematic you use to drive board layout. So there's no having to draw a schematic in a simulation tool, then redrawing the same schematic in the PCB design schematic tool. So you can get to a real board faster with fewer errors. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, exactly. And also one of the nice things that's just sort of a small differentiating factor is that you don't have to add any of those separate symbols for your voltage sources. You can just add those to the nets. And so if you have an already existing schematic and you want to simulate it, you don't have to overwhelm that page by adding separate symbols in there for your voltage sources.
That's a great point.
How can the advanced Monte Carlo option be used? So actually in a number of different ways. Just one example, when your models have all of the tolerance values included in them, you can use Monte Carlo as a way to easily predict the percentage of your boards that might fail in the real world due to the variability in those components. So you can get a lot of good information about how well your product is going to perform.
This is actually a really good question. Are there SPICE model libraries? And that seems like the foundation for everything in design is like the land patterns, the schematic symbols. People want to get those in place because they're really the building blocks for design in general. But are there SPICE model libraries? And actually, there are several hundred vendor SPICE models that are now part of the AMS install. So these models cover a variety of component types such as op-amps and diodes and MOSFETs and buffers from vendors like Analog Devices, Apex, Burr Brown, ComLinear, Linear Technology, National Semiconductor TI, and a whole bunch more. And these libraries include symbols for adding and simulating models in the design schematics. So you can just kind of hit the ground running.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition to that, there's actually for basic models like basic resistor models and capacitors, there's also included VHDL AMS models for those ones as well.
Great.
Which actually kind of leads into this next question. Can you use PSpice models with AMS? AMS does include an integrated PSpice converter. So even though PSpice models are not natively supported by PADS Pro AMS, you can easily convert those PSpice models to a SPICE format that is supported by the tool. Unfortunately, if the PSpice model is encrypted, you cannot use an encrypted PSpice model with PADS Pro AMS.
Gotcha. So just to kind of position this, if you just happen to tune into this because you're subscribing to this podcast and I want to know what the AMS webinar that we're answering Q&A for is actually going to be on demand from a live presentation last week. And there'll be a link for that in the show notes. So if you happen to have been a subscriber, you missed the webinar, now you're just learning about it through this podcast, you can actually go back and watch that recorded webinar.
Let's take on another question here. What are the advantages of using VHDL AMS models over SPICE models? So again, another good question. SPICE modeling is typically limited to built-in SPICE primitives, vendor or user-generated macro models, or equations added to controlled sources. But VHDL AMS modeling is much more flexible. Using the language, users can create physics-based models of device behavior at different levels of model abstraction. So VHDL AMS also enables mixed technology system-level modeling, so you can simulate your electronic designs in a model of the actual system. Basically, it just gives you a lot more flexibility and control over the values there and the functions of those models themselves.
So let me ask you, do you find the AMS for PADS Professional easy to use, set up?
Oh yeah. Especially if you've had any exposure to any of the free SPICE modeling programs like LT Spice, it's pretty much the same. It's just completely integrated, and you have all those model libraries. It's better because you can add it directly to your schematic, like we addressed in a previous question. But it'll feel very familiar if you've used any other sort of SPICE modeling before.
Well, that's great. I think that's good for people who are thinking they may have to look at the analog mixed signal for designs to, kind of get that warm fuzzy feeling.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's going to be, very intuitive and easy to use. So
yeah.
Great.
See, can you edit model functions within AMS? Editing parameters, such as changing a resistor value, is as easy as changing the property on that symbol. Like if in your schematic itself, if you just have the properties window open and you click on it, you click on that symbol, you can just change it directly from there. Additionally, for the VHDL AMS models, there's a straightforward process to add or edit calculations in a model to customize its function. So it's depending on what you want to do. It's both. Everything is doable. You can find the more advanced properties like I showed in the webinar itself. So that's definitely a possibility within AMS.
Oh, okay, great.
I've got a few more questions here. Can you import designs into PADS Pro Designer to use with AMS simulation that were made with the System Vision Cloud tool? So for those of you who aren't aware, we do have the free System Vision cloud program where you can go and create AMS schematics and you can simulate those with the SPICE models. And it's all free, it's all in the cloud. And there is actually an import tool available to help users download the System Vision cloud designs that you may have created. And you can use those in PADS AMS. So you have to download that separate tool, but it can be found on the System Vision website.
Oh, that's a great note. And I'm glad you brought that up because I'll actually include the System Vision URL in our show notes as well.
Perfect.
Thanks. Glad you brought it up.
Yeah, definitely. Just got one more question here. Is AMS included for free with PADS Professional? Really good question. Everybody cares about things that are included for free. The answer to that is yes. AMS is now included standard in PADS Professional. There's no additional costs or licenses that are associated with it.
That's great.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to add about AMS?
Just that I know from my own professional experience that there were times that I probably should have used it and it would have saved a little bit of time later on, because just those things that just seem simple and go unnoticed, kind of, as I showed in the webinar, just a wrong resistor value. Maybe you were copying and pasting a section from another part of the design, so you didn't have to, reinvent the wheel and you accidentally forgot to change some values. It's always a good idea to do these simulations so that you can catch problems like that. And also you can use them for more advanced purposes. Like I mentioned with Monte Carlo, you can find out a lot of information about how your system's going to work.
Let me ask you one other question. What particular technologies or particular products do you actually see, or product designers, engineers who are developing, types of products that will get the most value out of analog mixed signal simulation?
I think that it actually has a place and a value in just about every board that's created today. Some more than others. Obviously, if you are creating a product that's going to have a lot of A to D or D to A converters and a lot of that mixed signal technology, you're gonna have more use for it. But the BeagleBone Black design that I used was not necessarily complicated or even a quote AMS specific design. It wasn't just analog mixed signal, but I found a use for it in there with that LDO. So I really think it's got a place in pretty much every single design that's out there.
Wow, that's great. That's good to know, and I'm glad and I'm sure the audience is interested to know that too. Well, once again, Rebecca, thanks for joining me on PCB Tech Talk, the After the Webinar series.
Yeah, thanks, John.
I'm sure we'll be talking to you in a future episode.
Absolutely.
And thank you for joining me for this special After the Webinar series podcast. For more information on this podcast, as well as a link to the on-demand replay of the webinar discussed, be sure to check out the show notes. There, you'll also find additional information related to this podcast, along with my email address. So feel free to send me your comments and questions, or any topics you'd like to hear me talk about, or if you'd like to be my guest right here on PCB Tech Talk. I'm John McMillan. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. And be sure to catch the next episode of PCB Tech Talk.